Okay, excellent. So welcome everyone to our third panel of the Truth and Transformation Conference. My name is Angel Rodriguez. I am a research fellow with the IARA project, focusing on our healthcare research. And today I'm very excited to introduce a great panel of speakers, scholars, activists, and thinkers as we talk about reparations. So far today, we've learned that the shifting views around policy developments, especially full reparative efforts, have been really gaining momentum as they address systemic racism. Today, here at Harvard and also globally, the reparations movement is a broad spectrum of ways to return resources and to achieve progress around economic security, specifically in figuring out ways to close the racial gap in the US and again, globally. For this effort, we are engaging across sectors, including philanthropy, the private sector, healthcare, and even cultural institutions such as museums to participate. On today's third panel, titled Paying It Forward, we want to welcome, starting with our wonderful moderator, Dr. Leah Wright-Rigueur, who is SNF Gora Institute Professor at Johns Hopkins University. And we have a pleasure of having her as Senior Fellow at the IARA Project this year. For our speakers, we'd like to introduce Professor Cornell Brooks, who is Hauser Professor at Harvard Kennedy School. We also have Esther Stanford Kosei, who is a reparations specialist and Pan-Africanist community advocate. We also have Yahya Al-Azraq, who is executive director of the Resource Generation. Did I get that right? Excellent. And John Tateshi, who is author and member of the Japanese American Citizens League. So without further ado, Dr. Wright-Rigueur, please take it away. Oh, I think you're on mute.
There we go. The mute button strikes again. So thank you, Angel, for that very kind and warm welcome and introduction. And I'm thrilled to be here as part of this panel and as part of this conference, albeit virtual. But after talking to the panelists, we have, I think, come up with a way to make it feel like an in-person conversation. And we're also thrilled that so many of you will be able to join in given the virtual nature of this conversation. So what does it mean and what do we mean by paying it forward? Globally, reparations movements are gaining ground. These are the movements that focus on a broad spectrum of ways to return resources, achieve economic security, and close the racial wealth gap. This includes cash payments, repatriation of cultural artifacts, land givebacks, health access, philanthropic investments, and economic investments. And really what the panel is designed to do today, and what we hope to get from the audience as well during our Q&A, is thinking about what we can learn from these latest efforts in the United States and globally. Of course, looking into the future, the big question is, how can we make reparations work? So I thought I would start out and put one of our panelists in the hot seat, and that's Cornell. I thought I would start out by perhaps asking a big overarching question and perhaps even a controversial question. Globally, I think many people think and hear reparations, and the first thing they think is money. They also think that the pathway to reparations is impossible. So I'm wondering a couple of things. First, what do you consider reparations or reparative mechanisms? The second question is really thinking about what are the precedents and pathways to making payments for injured or marginalized or populations that have been hurt. And then, of course, third, is there a way forward or pathway forward that actually builds on the historical campaigns that we've seen from members of American Congress, like Congressman Conyers and others, particularly other communities? So 3 questions posing as once. Cornell, you want to start us off?
Sure. 3 questions to be answered in roughly 4 minutes. So I'll begin.
If you need to take a little bit longer, I threw a doozy at you. So
Okay.
if you need to answer, if you need a little bit longer, that's okay.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me just begin with a word of appreciation to Dr. Khalil Muhammad, his team, our moderator, my co-panelists in this work. So I begin with a word of appreciation and respect. As you've noted, we enter this conversation at a particular moment in history where around the world, we see people, communities, organizations engaged in efforts at reckoning with history and seeking reparations. And over again, we find three objections raised. The first of which, reparations, particularly in the United States, are untimely. The harm occurred too long ago, that it is unworkable, that is programmatically, administratively impossible. And lastly, that it is unaffordable, that is too costly. So I just like to begin, foundationally speaking, by addressing those objections, which are not unique to the United States. But one thing I would note here is my colleague, Professor Linda Bilmes at the Kennedy School, we engaged in research where we have examined what we call reparations what are not called reparations in the United States, but in fact operate as reparations. And so in the federal government, there is a fiscal norm, an administrative norm, a moral norm, such that we recognize people who have suffered a harm, often a non-racial harm, and there's an effort to make that person whole, particularly when the harm was visited upon them as a consequence of no fault of their own. And when you look across the arc of American history and look at the federal government's response, what you see over and over again in terms of people who are farmers who lost a crop as a consequence of a natural disaster. You see people who build homes and lose them in a hurricane or a flood. The government compensates them. We see veterans who lose a limb in battle or on base during peacetime, and you see them compensated. And when we look at these programs over the course of many decades, we see a norm at work. My colleague and I call the response to these harms, often non-racial harms, we call them reparatory compensation. Now, why is that important? It is important because it means that certainly in the case of the United States, we are skilled, well-versed in recognizing harms, identifying claimants, identifying people who are deserving of being made whole. Why is this important? So if we look at Black veterans who came back home after World War II, who were offered the GI Bill but denied access to its educational benefits, the scholarships to go to college, or denied housing benefits, that is to say, loans to purchase homes as a consequence of their race. What we saw there was an intergenerational consequence, namely, not only Black people being prevented, Black veterans being prevented from attending college or university, specifically non-HBCUs, but because those HBCUs did not have medical schools, did not have engineering schools, in the main did not have law schools, they were shut out of the professions. This, of course, had an intergenerational consequence in terms of wealth, but also the ability of Black people as a whole to retain wealth, hold on to wealth, and to pursue wealth, right? In addition to that, when they were denied access to housing, a prime driver of intergenerational wealth, this, of course, has consequences into the very moment. Now, why is that important? When we look at veterans programs today literally provide benefits to veterans and their descendants, right? Their children, their grandchildren. And so the point being here is certainly in the United States, we have the skill, we lack the will, we have the expertise, we have the experience. There's a fiscal, moral, and programmatic norm to engage in reparations. And so the point being here is reparations, certainly in this context, means that reparations is often regular and routine as opposed to being aberrational and exceptional. Now, what are the implications for the global community seeking reparations? Well, it says that in many instances, in terms of responding to non-racial harms, we have the ability to identify a variety of claimants and victims. We have the ability to do so across generations. Not only that, we have the administrative and programmatic and moral imagination to identify particular funding streams, whether it be an excise tax, whether it be insurance, whether it be scholarships, whether it be cash payments. So to your point of cash payments, yes, cash payments plus, cash payments and cash payments in addition to a variety of responses in terms of reparatory compensation. The last point I'll make here is this. So we go back 100 years ago and we think about a Black woman by the name of Callie Guy House, who created an organization in the wake of slavery to provide for aging, formerly enslaved people, and to seek reparations from the federal government in terms of cash payments. So there was relief and cash payments. If she had the administrative, moral, programmatic imagination 100 years ago, how much more can we do today, right? So in other words, if our forebears did what they did then, what more can we do today?
Bravo.
All right, thank you, Cornell. And that was, I'm impressed at the brevity of your statement. I'm going to turn my attention over to John, and I'm going to both ask you a new question and ask you something similar to what I asked Cornell. So I'm thinking about the work that you've done and thinking about this more big picture. And I'm wondering, how has the approach to organizing, advocacy, and policy changed for reparations or shifted over the last 10 years? And I also want to, again, ask you a similar question to what I asked Cornell, which is, how does this build more broadly on these older or historical campaigns that have undergone? But I'm also interested in hearing, perhaps from a different perspective, how this has worked.
You know, thank you. I appreciate that. I'd like to echo Professor Brooks's appreciation to everyone who's involved in putting this together. It's a pretty remarkable conference. To answer your question, I think back on the situation when we Japanese Americans began this process to seek some form of reparative justice. There were no fancy words for us. We didn't know exactly what had happened to us. It was for us a discovery. The majority of Japanese Americans opposed the idea of reparations, said that it's not something we do culturally, that we're a proud people and we do not accept this type of what they called a handout. We had to explain to our community that this wasn't only for ourselves. This was to correct an injustice in the country, to somehow find a way to heal and fix the injuries. And for us, the big picture was always the Constitution. That's what resonated with Japanese Americans. But when we started this whole process, I happened to be in a position where I was leading the campaign with an organization called the Japanese American Citizens League. And I went to see Congressman Conyers, John Conyers, in 1979 as we began our process, not knowing, quite honestly, what the heck we were doing. No one had ever done this. I mean, we had no models to work from. And so our idea was that we would seek direct compensation and fight the good fight, knowing we'd probably lose, but at least it would be an honest fight for justice. And when I saw Conyers, he talked about what he had in mind for the injustices of slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and on and on and on. And he talked about his bill being similar to what we were trying to do. It was in a meeting with the Japanese American members of Congress. There were only 4 at the time. Daniel Inouye, senator from Hawaii, and junior senator Spark Matsunaga, Norm Mineta, who eventually became better known as secretary in the cabinet, and Congressman from Sacramento, Bob Matsui. In that meeting, the idea of a commission evolved. It was suggested by Dan Inouye. It was not anything any of us who were advocating reparations wanted, because we wanted that fight to go after the money bill. But he made so much sense in describing what a commission could do that we accepted that strategy, much to the discomfort and anger of not only our own membership in the JACL, but the Japanese American community. But this was the only way we could see getting to where we wanted to get. And as it turned out, it turned out to be a brilliant strategy because it accomplished so much more than what we probably could have even come close to just denting. The biggest factor was that we had these public hearings where Japanese Americans were given the opportunity to speak to the government as such, the commissioners, and to talk about what their own personal experiences were. Without all the recognition of how significant this was, I thought it was important because it was the first time our parents' generation, the Nisei generation, could voice their views of what that experience of World War II was like for them. It turns out it was what would eventually become to known as truth and reconciliation. And it was the first time I think anyone had seen this kind of thing happening, because the few models that existed before we started our effort didn't have this kind of pathway. And this wasn't something we chose. This is something we did because we realized this was the most feasible way to get there. There was just almost chaos at times in the Japanese American community. We were on our own. We had no coalition partners at that point. No one thought this was a good thing to do because it was going to damage future efforts by our failure as proof that you can't do this, which is why no one ever tried it before. But within our own community, there was so much disagreement and anger and vitriol being tossed at each other that it made it difficult. It was really tumultuous until those hearings and those Nisei testimonies. And following that, the commission issued a report and then issued recommendations, which we accepted and put into a bill. It was the first time that this became sort of a smooth path towards the goal that we sought. And it made it seem this is going to be possible because suddenly everybody backed the bill. I mean, before it was like driving through a thick forest in an armored car, people shooting at you from the outside and people shooting from inside. And then suddenly we're on this highway, smooth and beautiful, and you could see straight ahead to where the end was. But the big question for us, and I think is part of what we'll be talking about today, is what exactly do you mean by reparations? What philosophically is reparations about? That was a decision we had to make, and I spent weeks and months thinking about that before we reached that point where we would drive this issue. Because at first we talked about this as a reparations campaign, but that didn't resonate with the older generations. They were really opposed to the idea of money. And when we realized we're looking at something much larger, we're trying to help the country heal. You know, it was very altruistic and perhaps a bit foolish of us to think that we could accomplish that. But we decided that reparations wasn't the right word for us, that it was really about redress, that we were trying to get the country to redress the injustice and in doing so, to prevent this from happening again. So that was our goal. And in talking about that, the concept of reparations became really critical because philosophically, however you decide that and however you decide who gets included, creates all the difference in the world. And, it's something you toil with as you try to guide this kind of an effort. The landscape over the past 10 years has changed dramatically. For one, I think we all realize we need to work as coalition. We need to work as partners and support each other's efforts. And certainly with, for example, the Black reparations movement, Japanese Americans are solidly behind that. And there are so many other kinds of things going on now, but in this country, the big picture is Black reparations. That will be the driving force, I think, for the civil rights community over the next several years, if not longer. It's a tough road, but the landscape has shifted, and there's an awareness now of why we need to do this. And Dr. Brooks talked about too costly, the timing's wrong, or it's been too long. Time doesn't matter on injustice. It needs to be corrected. Whether it was 250 years ago or 50 years ago, you need to correct it. And until you do, it remains an open wound in the psyche of the country. And in terms of the cost, there are estimates, and among some of the leaders of some of the leading thinkers about Black reparations, of amounts in the trillions. And as I talk to public audiences, and this always comes up, but it happened so long ago, not my generation, I don't believe in slavery. And then the money. And I always say it's probably going to cost around 13 trillion, maybe a little bit more, but what's a trillion, one or two added? And everyone will say that's too much. But then my question always is, can we afford not to do this? Because we've suffered as a nation as a result of this kind of injury that was caused as the nation was being created, that we owe it to ourselves as a nation to rectify that injustice, which will always remain, along with the genocidal wars against the native tribes, will be the greatest injustice ever committed in this country. And I don't think we can afford not to do something about that.
Certainly. So thank you, John, for that. And I think you've given us a lot to think about, but in particular, this question between reparations and redress, but also in thinking about what are the methods of implementation for these various approaches. And so with that, I'd like to actually turn to Yaya to ask you a little bit more about the organization that you run, that you've put together. And I'm wondering if you can describe for us how your organization or your institution seeks to equitably redistribute money. And why is work organizing young Americans with high net wealth related to a conversation on reparations or redress? And I find this absolutely fascinating. So I'd love to hear from you on this.
Yeah, totally. So glad to be here. Hi, everyone. Well, first, I just want to start off, I think, just like building on what John was just saying, that it's like, yes, it's like materially, right? And I think materially is only one component, like, of reparations. It's going to cost trillions of dollars. And in the past few years, right, like, we've seen the government be able to mobilize, right, trillions of dollars, right, like in the, I think, in reparatory compensation, right, like during the COVID pandemic. And so the levers are there, the mechanisms are there, right? And I think that it is a matter, right, like, of political will and building the power, like, of our movements, I think, to advocate for the systemic change that we need. But to Resource Generation, the organization that I'm the executive director of, just to start off, we are a 24-year-old organization. We have 1,100 dues-paying members who are mostly white, but we're a multiracial membership organization. We have 20 chapters around the country. And we are doing base building and leadership development of young people with access to wealth, and pointing that power towards, I think, 3 redistributive strategies. I think the first, obviously, being resource mobilization. Our community is moving over $100 million a year to racial and economic justice, grassroots organizing efforts here in the United States, and some amount internationally as well. I think the second one is being a part of issue-based campaigns, predominantly at the local level, where our chapters are partnering with other organizations who are trying to move the needle and be winning on fights for redistribution. And then I think the third one, which I think is the biggest and the loftiest, and perhaps even the most important, is shifting the culture and changing the narrative, I think, about accumulated wealth, where it comes from, about the culture of hoarding wealth, the culture around, I think, the slim safety net that we have, right, like in this country, that then creates the need or the perceived need for people to accumulate wealth. And so I think that a former colleague of mine, Danielle West, I think put it very, is doing voluntary redistribution in service of involuntary redistribution. And so I think we're trying to leverage the power of our membership to be winning, I think, on the campaigns that are going to move things back in the direction of justice and righteousness over the long term. And I think just to when I'm thinking specifically about the concept like of reparations, I think about my own story. I come from like a mixed class background. My father in Morocco is owning class and owns and operates plastic factories there. But I was raised here in the US in a poor to lower middle class home with a white American mother. And so I think as an American, right, with settler colonist ancestry, with white ancestry, right, I feel like I have an obligation to be advocating and pushing for the systemic redistribution and reparations here in this country. But yet as a Moroccan, right, and as the child of a business owner, I think that more concretely, when I think about reparations, I think about when I inherit shares of my family business, what would it look like for me to gift those shares to the workers who have spent, decades and many years of their lives building the wealth and the privilege upon which my life has been built, and that will be a material process, but it's also going to be like a relational process. We'll likely have to move back to Morocco. I don't know what the status of employee ownership is there currently, and there will probably be many steps in order to make that a reality. And I think that we have been doing this work, as I said, for decades now. And I do think that in the past 5 to 10 years, there's such a culture shift that is happening, right? I think even the words like reparations being used, right, as a part of public discourse, right, thinking about the amount of language around mutual aid and reparations, in the face of this most recent pandemic that wasn't there, right, during the economic crisis of 2008 and 2009. And even today, in the New York Times, there's a story about Marlena Engelhorn, who is in Europe and is going to be inheriting a lot of wealth and is advocating for higher taxes on the wealthy. That the framing of that narrative is not framing taxing wealth or redistribution as an outlandish idea, which much of our media coverage in our early years was really, I think, through the lens of spectacle. Look at these wealthy people who are trying to give away their money. Look at how naive they are, right? That they think that they can change things through their individual choices, or they're ungrateful, right, for the privileges that they've been given. But now I think the conversation is treating, I think, the moral, social, and emotional impulses of our membership towards redistribution as something that, I think is both worth taking seriously and worth, I think, bringing into our national conversation.
Well, thank you for that. That's certainly a lot. And I think what we'll do, in turning to our last panelist, but certainly not least panelist, is think about how this context works, not simply within the United States, although Yaya has given us a really, I think, perhaps unintentionally or perhaps intentionally global perspective, but to think about how this works beyond the borders of the United States. So with that, I want to turn my attention to Esther, who is working on these issues in the United Kingdom, and ask you, what is happening right now in the United Kingdom in these conversations, but also in advocacy, organizing, institutionalizing work? You know, I'd love to hear what's different, what's similar, what's, you know, in comparison to the United States and to what we've heard about even just today.
Thank you. And I also extend my thanks for the invitation to participate in this panel, because I often feel that those of us in the UK who are especially focused on what we refer to as African reparations rather than slavery reparations are often treated and seen as the unwelcome relation. And I think it's because our approaches are much more complex, much more holistic than what I see in terms of dominant perspectives coming out of the United States of America. So first of all, the movement for African reparations in the UK goes back to the mid-1700s. And this is a history that is often just totally ignored. And one of the key kind of defining features of the movement for African reparations in the UK is one that we define it in that way. We don't define it in terms of slavery or even colonialism, but in terms of who we are. And this is all people of African descent or heritage, ancestry, irrespective of whether we're born in the British Isles or whether we're born in the Caribbean and parents came, you know, to Britain as economic migrants in the 50s or 60s, or whether we're born directly on the continent of Africa or anywhere else in the African diaspora. So the key thing about the UK movement is that it's very Pan-Africanist, very Pan-Caribbean, where we have Caribbean communities, and also very internationalist, what we would refer to as Black internationalist. And that is because of the nature of the British Empire and the fact that we have people now living in Britain from all parts of the empire who have had a similar experience and who therefore have been able to form strategies and tactics that speak to a global reality. So this notion of reparations for Black people in Britain does not exist as a concept because many of us have come from somewhere else. And so we bring those perspectives, like for instance, myself, my parents, one parent was born in Barbados, the other in Guyana in South America, and origins coming from West Africa. And so because we kind of always kept this connection to Africa, our motherland and homeland that we were trafficked from, kidnapped from, dispossessed of, that has been a kind of long-standing call to return to and to be restored with our, you know, our kith and kin in our motherland, or certainly to kind of restore those connections with each other. So those are some of the key differences that I would say. And it matters because it means that we see our restitution as being about restoring our right to belong to our homeland, to have that global citizenship, to have a Pan-African Union of communities, which unfortunately is not the current African Union. This is part of a repaired vision of a repaired Africa that transcends the borders of the 1884-1885 Berlin Conference, and that actually restores African forms of indigeneity that, you know, transcends those borders. And many of us, through oral history or whether we do DNA, can link ourselves right back into particular specific communities and nations. And so that is really the heart of our struggle in terms of the big picture and strategic goals. It's not about somehow thinking that we're going to gain parity or so-called equality in the British Isles when our homeland itself is actually being dispossessed. We continue to be dispossessed of our wealth and resources. And so therefore our global power base to be able to even impact and affect our will in terms of reparations. And a big part of it is why that matters is that there's still so much colonization, so many corporations that are extracting wealth you know, above the heads of African people, both on the continent and in the diaspora, including us, who have been dispossessed for centuries. And we feel that that is the easiest way of actually restituting resources, stopping that extractivism and that harm that is being done today and obviously tracing it back historically. So in terms of our movement, we recognize that there's not only an African section to the movement, which we refer to as the International Social Movement for African Reparations. We also recognize that some of our strategic goals in terms of world transformation and world remaking cannot be affected unless we also harmonize our strategies and tactics with other reparationists from other nations who have also experienced European settler colonialism and dispossessions, for instance, such as Aboriginal people, indigenous peoples of the America, Asian people who have been colonized. And so we recognize this wider movement as the People's Reparations International Movement. And what we see is not only this repaired and restored Africa that we have a right to belong to, irrespective of whether we choose to live or rematriate to Africa, but we should be able to exercise our global citizenship wherever we are, because we've made communities and we've settled in other places. But we recognize that this repaired Africa must also be part of a repaired world that we refer to as Ubuntu Dunia, which is really a multipolar, pluriversal world of global justice that is, for all. And this repaired Africa is called Ma'atu Ubuntu Man, which is a Pan-African union of communities premised on the ancient Kemetic notion of Ma'at, which sort of is a philosophical system, ethical system, and also Ubuntu, recognizing that our humanity is best expressed not only in how we treat each other within our own group, but also how we interface with other members of the human family. And locally or globally, what this looks like is African heritage communities across the board, whether, as I said, we're born in Britain, born in the Caribbean, born in other parts of Abya Yala, the so-called Americas, or Africa, forming ourselves into what we refer to in English as African heritage communities for national self-determination. Because for us, a key part of our struggle for repair must be about restoring our national self-determination as nations who are oppressed, who are, dispersed, and who are seeking to restore and remember ourselves globally. And so this is what we refer to as these satellite communities that form the building blocks of this wider transformative world-making or re-world-making project. And we refer to these satellite communities in the diaspora as Ma'atu Ubuntu Jammers. And so for us, the repair is about us saying we want to build community because we cannot rely on government. We're in a worldwide climate and ecological crisis. In the UK, I'm sure you've been hearing about the political situation here. It is a mess. So communities are not relying on states. And the nature of the crisis and the dispossessions we're facing, whether it's in the Caribbean, other small island nation states, on the continent of Africa, is that we are losing land, we are, becoming climate refugees. And so for all of us, what we see is that communities have to be part of transformative adaptation. And so what I would say as well is that in our movement, it also links very closely with movements around environmental and ecological repair. And we actually refer to planet repairs as recognizing that the harm has not only been done to us as African people, the mothers and fathers of humanity, but also the harm has been done to the way that we relate to our Mother Earth, that which sustains all our lives. And this kind of way in which we feel that everything can be sold and reduced to a commercial value is part of the destruction, the epistemicide, the denial of our indigenous knowledge systems, which were demonized. And actually now many people of sense are returning to. So these are some of the key differences. And so it means that it's not an easy fix because we're trying to operate globally, which is thinking and recognizing the global dimensions, but how do we, operationalize that within local context? And so we've got a key campaign called the Stop the Maangamizi campaign, which really means the African Holocaust and continuum of chattel slavery, colonialism, and neo-colonialism. And so what we do is a lot of our strategies and tactics focus on how do we stop that Maangamizi of today, which roots back to the historic Maangamizi that our foreparents experienced, but which today is on our watch. And how do we ensure that we transform the world and world relations so that our children can be guaranteed a future, which at the moment, because of the way in which the global system operates, and there isn't kind of this very much focus on structural transformation globally, not just within the United States of America, that we feel that a lot of the reparations strategies and tactics are not missing the mark because we are not dislodging imperialism. So it means people are still being trafficked today. People are still being, moved off of their lands today. People are still being dispossessed today. And what we're trying to do through our movement, recognizing the 5 principles of reparations under international law, we focus equally on the stopping of the harm and also the guarantees of non-repetition, not just compensation within a world order that remains the same and unchanged. And with this in mind, we've been able to influence elected officials from what we would call the mainstream political parties in the UK, including the Green Party, the Labour Party, and we've been able to now set up within the UK Houses of Parliament an all-party parliamentary group for African reparations that takes on board all of these perspectives and is able to unify other reparations groups who recognise that, yes, the African case might be a pivotal case, but it's not the only one. And how do we now interface with all these reparations movements who are equally struggling for different types of reparatory justice, but outside of a global context, a global strategy and tactics that looks at how we all interconnect together? And how do we ensure our reparations efforts really bring about a situation of never again, not just for us, but for all members of the human family?
Okay.
Wow.
So thank you, Esther, for that. Thank you so much. And what a way to kind of put a bow, I think, on the participants and the panelists' insights. But what we're going to do now in the roughly 20 minutes we have remaining is take questions from the audience. Now, if you're familiar with the Harvard Kennedy School, you know that one of the things that we like to do is for audience members to certainly ask questions, but to make sure that those questions are actually questions. So please, we welcome your questions. You are free to write them in the chat or free to send them through the various mechanisms. And I'm going to start us out with a question. I'm going to toss it over to the panelists. Anybody can jump in. You guys can also choose not to answer this, but I'm going to start off with a question from a Kevin, who says, I remember concerning all that was included, that there was a discussion in the period between 2000 and 2009 that reparations would go to those who least benefited from desegregation. However, the colorblind narrative was common back then. How has the decline of the colorblind narrative affected this particular point and the conversations in general?
I want to make sure I understood the question. So the question goes to how do we ensure that reparations doesn't go to those who least benefited from?
Well, I think the idea is that in the, the early aughts, there was this conversation that was deeply influenced by the idea of a colorblind perspective, right? Or colorblind narrative that really pushed back at the idea of race conscious reparations or redress.
Right.
But that colorblind narrative seems to have been exploded, at least in the last really 10 years or so. So the user is asking, or the audience member is asking, right, how has the decline of the, of this colorblind narrative really affected, I think, the perhaps success or the rise of the reparations conversation at this point?
Sure. So I think with the Obama presidency and this notion that we are post-racial America, with the demise of unfortunately that rise of that hope and the demise of that myth, it's opened the door for an intellectual and analytic and historical candor and honesty. So if we think about this era of mass incarceration in which we find ourselves, we think about Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, naming very, very clearly that the racial disparities, for example, in the criminal legal system are race-based. And so the point being here is in this current conversation about reparations, we have to be honest about the history. So in other words, it's not only that Black people, certainly in America, were enslaved and that slavery was driven by a color caste system. It is also that the convict leasing system was a racial harm, right? So we went from 4 million or 3.9 million prior to 1865 to at least 1 million after that. And that convict leasing system didn't end officially until the opening days of World War II. All of these racial harms are specific and targeted. So while there is a certain advocacy benefit, a certain utilitarian benefit for arguing for universal benefits that disproportionately help people of color and particularly Black people, we can't whitewash and we can't homogenize the history, which quite often means that we underfit the remedy, right? So in other words, if we're not accurate and precise with respect to the wrong, it means we ask for less or ask for things which are ill-fitting with respect to remedies. And I'm saying that, that not only as a Harvard professor, but as somebody who's litigated cases in the federal courts, prosecuting civil rights cases, engaged in demonstrations, regulatory and legislative litigation for 25, 30 years, right? You can't lie about the harm and hope to have a good prognosis or diagnosis.
I don't see how you can not distinguish the issue on the color line. I mean, if you're talking about reparation, yeah, sure. I have a couple of friends who are Irish who talk about in the history of the Irish in America. Mm-hmm. And this is kind of like, oh, you think you had it bad. But then you compare where they go from that to where they are now, and the obstacles they didn't have to face, or the things that didn't happen to the Irish as a result of what they look like. You look at any of us on this panel, and it's a color distinction. And it seems to me, if you're talking about reparations, you're talking about a really significant incident in our past as a nation or throughout the world, and the destruction and the attempt to destroy peoples who are subjugated within their societies. And that's always been based on color lines. I don't know how you can diminish that in any way. Race is race. And those who say we need to not think in terms of race, I have to question their thinking.
We have another question here, and I want to unpack this because it's actually something I think that many of the panelists mentioned, not necessarily offhand, but as part of their remarks, an essential part of their remarks. And so this audience member says, do you think reparations are useful, even though we haven't dismantled the unjust structures, right, that surround us, make up these various things? Several of you mentioned colonialism, several of you mentioned imperialism, discrimination, right, internment, things like that. But we haven't dismantled these unjust structures and institutions, and we haven't dismantled the cultural attitudes that justified, right, that the original discrimination or injustice. So essentially, the audience member is asking, how useful is reparations when we haven't gotten rid of the original, right, or the root problem? So I'd love to hear from the panelists.
I'd love to start this one off, which I think, and I think we've touched on this as well. Like, I think we have to start with, right, like an understanding that like material redress as only being like one part, right, like of reparations, right, and I think that yeah, Esther was bringing up, right, there are these other components, right, there is like the promise, right, to not repeat the harms that have been committed, right, and that there's this, yeah, and that we need to pursue, I think, like, right, like the reparative, the relational, the cultural, like, aspects, right, to stop the harms that are continuing to happen. And I think if we were to distribute, I think, like, all of the wealth, like, in this country to everyone, that I think within a matter of years, perhaps decades at best, right, that the wealth would re-stratify into very similar hands as it's held today. If we're not talking about, right, like the means of production, if we're not talking about like who owns land, right, who owns the businesses, right, and the places in which wealth is like allowed to be accumulated and hoarded. And so I think that reparations is an important and useful conversation. And I think that we are limiting ourselves when we are only talking about reparations, right, like in terms of the monetary aspect of it, which is why I think like at Resource Generation, we have like a huge impetus on our members, like redistributing their wealth. And we ask them to give away all or almost all of the wealth that they've inherited or earned. And that doing that alone without being a part of the campaigns for systemic change and actually changing what ownership, what power our communities have is only doing, I think, the smallest part of what a project of reparations like would entail.
If I can lift up a historical example, I'm recalling Henrietta Wood, who during the days of slavery, who was captured and as a free woman taken into slavery. She subsequently files a lawsuit and she receives a modest amount of money. If we look at what happened, she received a payment, if you will, for her period of enslavement. She used that money to educate herself, to invest, and the consequences across generations were that it lifted literally her family into an entirely different economic trajectory. And so we well understand the need to cease the harm, but let us note the fact that in remedying the harm, we put those who are in fact harmed in a position, stronger position, such that they're able to fight against the continuance of the harm, right? So this whole notion that we need to cease the harm in order to begin addressing the harm literally confines people, relegates people to a pit of their own demise and despair. And so we need to be very clear that there are numerous historical examples where we see people who are better economically resourced, in a better political, economic position to fight against injustice. And the last point here is, if we take Sandy Darity's work seriously, and John has spoken to this in terms of a multi-trillion-dollar racial wealth gap, we cannot essentially impoverish the patient, and then insist that we can do nothing until we stop what is in fact the cause of the harm. So yes.
I think that's a really important point. I mean, to say that we should somehow find a way to resolve this issue of systemic and institutional racism before we do something like reparations is to say, let's not do anything at all. Because, I mean, it's like changing the mind of a white supremacist to understand that he or she is no better simply because of the way he or she looks. And the converse of that, I think, could be if, and Darity and Mullins talk about this, that if you lessen the disparity of the wealth gap, that it brings advantages to African Americans who have been closed off from all these different opportunities. Perhaps that's the step towards then attacking this kind of systemic and institutional racism that exists in this country. Because as long as you keep Blacks suppressed by wealth, I don't know how you resolve a lot of these other inherent problems that we have in society. And it's so racist, and it's so galling to talk to people who really do see other people as less than they. And to me, I don't see that there's any rationale that would guide that thinking, that we need to first resolve the institutions of the country, the racism in these institutions, before we can really act towards equality and through reparations. I think it's going to have to go the other way. I think you need to demand reparations, get reparations, and demonstrate to this country that does no harm to the country. In fact, if anything, it improves it, because you don't have these huge disparities. And you think about the 1%, this famous 1% of America. You just tax them and you can afford reparations. But as a nation, we don't have that kind of courage, because they have the wealth and the power.
All right, so we have time for one more question. And there is one question in the queue that I think is provocative, thought-provoking, and just really does a great, fantastic job of summing up a lot of what we've talked about today and the panelists' different perspectives. So here we go. I would love to hear the U.S. participants, but also Esther as well, respond to Esther's call for a Pan-African reparations movement not tied to enslavement. Is the U.S. focus in part a product of our legal system that requires a clear relationship between harm and remedy, and that slavery is an easy harm to identify, or is it something else entirely? So I'd love to hear from the panelists in the 3 minutes we have remaining. Is there a way that we can think about it, and given the framework that Esther has so very generously shared with us today?
I'll simply say this, that I think it's important not to disconnect the U.S. narrative and history from the global extraction of wealth and people and capital over the course of generations. And if we limit the discussion of reparations to slavery only, it understates both the problem and the remedy. Why? Because certainly the aftermath of slavery, right, in terms of the kind of neo-slavery we've seen in this country, mass incarceration, all the other ills, speak to the breadth of the problem. That is true certainly within the United States. It is certainly true globally. So I think Esther is right. But I would note that it is important for us to focus on readily identifiable and understood harms, just as a matter of advocacy, to explain the history to people, certainly in this country, to get them to move, right? So Esther is, I think, ultimately right, but pragmatically and practically speaking, we have to talk about, at least start with the harm that they best understand.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I love what Esther describes as the global movement. As I listen to you, I want to raise my hand and say, sign me up, because this is such a profound kind of movement. But I think strategically within the United States, you have to tie it to slavery, because that's what people understand. People in this country are not so altruistic that they would say, oh, we've done some harm, we don't quite know in the bigger picture or bigger perspective of the world and how those who come from certain nations have been disadvantaged. What Americans understand is slavery and Jim Crow And I think strategically, from a legislative point of view, it has to be tied. Reparations in America for Black Americans has to be tied to the issue of slavery, because that is the damage that's created our society to be as it is today.
Well, with that, we are all done. I'd like to give us all, everyone in the audience, to give a virtual round of applause to our panelists. I'd also love to thank the Truth and Transformation organizers, the IARA team, and of course, Dr. Khalil Muhammad for putting this all together, and of course, putting us all in conversation. So thank you again. If anything, this conversation leaves me hopeful about the future and optimistic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Rigueur, and to our panelists. What an incredible conversation. My name is Carla Arevalo, and I am a graduate research assistant with the IARA team. Wow, the end of the day is almost here. Thank you so much. Thank you for everyone in the audience joining us. As we go to our closing remarks, I would like to introduce Dr. Magda Matache. Dr. Magda Matache is a lecturer on social and behavioral sciences at the Department of Social and Behavioral Science at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She's also the director of the Roma program at the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard University. Her research focuses on systems of oppression with a focus on anti-Roma racism. With more than 20 years of experience in activism and research, Dr. Matache has dedicated her work to advancing justice and Roma rights. We are very excited and appreciative for Dr. Matache offering closing remarks and highlights from the day with us now.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for your kind words of introduction. What an exceptional event. So kudos to the IARA team. It is a great honor to contribute concluding remarks at the end of a day full of absorbing, heartfelt, intense, and most importantly, necessary dialogues and ideas. And I do hope I do justice to the richness and depth brought to this conversation by activists, musicians, practitioners, scholars, scholar activists, or more simply and precisely, all our guest speakers whose ideas and actions are not tied to their careers, as Professor Cornel West would say, but to a calling, a vocation, a commitment to true justice. In my remarks, I will touch upon 4 big topics discussed throughout our symposium: land return, affirmative action, memorialization, and the reparations. Still, in framing this conference, the IARA team asked us, how can truth and transformation be achieved through historical accountability? Thus, I would like to start by pointing at the importance of the very idea of truth and truth-telling, inspired by many panelists who mentioned the importance of truth, including Elika Datseton, Catherine Hall, and Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who said yesterday that this is truth-telling time. Historical truth has always been meaningful to many of us who belong to historically oppressed communities, as across the world, a tactic employed by various systems of oppression has been to bury, erase, distort, and silence the histories, pains, and stories of our communities and families. Yet that tactic becomes blunter and more noticeable now in times when the historical truth about various racisms and oppressions is rising, but is perceived and received as a threat in times when the truth about our histories becomes not factual, but political. For a few years now in the United States, politicians and opinion makers at the state and federal levels have been very explicit about their opposition to education, about what they called divisive ideologies, but what essentially means opposition to the celebrated 1619 Project, sites of memory, and Black, Jewish, or Native American history. Thus, as Gloria Ladson-Billings underlined, what we're seeing in 26 states across the nation is that we can't even mention the truth. And it is not just the United States. In Hungary, for example, the government has defunded and banned gender studies in universities and started anti-LGBTQ+ and anti-Roma campaigns. Yet between the rise of memory and the elimination of memory, some moderate and progressive voices deliver statements acknowledging injustices, issuing declarations or apologies, or engaging in other symbolic forms of acknowledgement. But is that enough? And that question leads me to the first topic discussed at this conference, namely land acknowledgement and land return. Yesterday, Michaela Madrid and Jessica Glidden from the Native Government Center guided us to understand the limitations and the performative nature of land acknowledgement when that is an isolated action, our only action. Sometimes, as they explained, a land acknowledgement may be received like empty words and optical allyship. So as an alternative, or perhaps in addition, they suggested concrete, actionable steps, ongoing commitment to indigenous peoples. For instance, to honor, respect, and support the centrality of land in indigenous communities, individuals and organizations could donate to indigenous organizations, join indigenous-led protests, and support the land back movement. And as Talia Landry powerfully proposed this morning, we need to learn and know the actual history of the lands, including the history of Harvard and its connection to the oppression of Native Americans. And speaking of the land back movement, Alvin Warren, our keynote speaker today, argued that to understand what the land back movement is about, we need to challenge what we have been taught constantly, lies and stereotypes about Native people, to achieve Native invisibility, to justify war, commit genocide, rip territories, relocate people, impose foreign systems of government, and decimate resources. Land theft, he argued, has been a critical factor in the wealth and income inequities in the United States. Alvin Warren also talked about a long advocacy history which has demanded that the right to the land, territories, and resources that Native Americans have traditionally owned be respected. Many communities have had to actually buy back fractions of lands that have been stolen from them. But do we still subscribe to this racist ideology and practice? Warren argued that we could create and contribute to change and offer a few possible actions. We can learn about tribal nations and unlearn myths, move from panic and guilt to a place of responsibility. We can donate land or donate money to Native organizations who work with land back movements, and we can advocate for federal and state policies. And concretely, he mentioned support for HR 8108 and HR 8189. Finally, Warren challenged, and I really like that, the Harvard School of Government students to think and address the doctrine of discovery as a true adaptive challenge. Moving forward to the topic of affirmative action, I have to say that this is personal to me, as I benefited from such a policy in Romania. In my home country, however, the program has never been acknowledged for its reparative function in relation to a history of 500 years of slavery, the Holocaust, forced assimilation, and generally a history of injustice against the Roma people. It has always been framed as a method of integration, as social and economic support for uneducated gypsies. So white Romanians do make sure that we are always reminded that we are still inferior gypsies to them. Nevertheless, the affirmative action policy is still in place. However, as we've learned today, that has not been the case of the United States since the 1970s, when the Bucky case, for example, challenged affirmative action, or as Professor Latson Billings put it, turned Brown on its head and made it be about white students. And this is a point that Professor Brown Marshall also touched upon, unpacking how the repair rationale was replaced by diversity as a benefit for the white people who are going to be leaders and needed to understand their communities better. So essentially, the panel today dived into the history and the impact of this great retreat, the shift from affirmative action to diversity or DEI policies, from the reparative to the diversity argument. The panel also reminded us that the main beneficiaries of affirmative action have been white women, and that in this equation, we can't neglect legacy students and others as well. Furthermore, the panel also reflected on the current Harvard and University of North Carolina cases brought before the Supreme Court. And this is an issue that Melissa Harris Perry mentioned last night too, when she asked if we are facing the end of affirmative action in the United States. Professor Warrico added a critique on the systems of meritocracy, and Elika Datseton led us into the work of visions and concrete initiatives to dismantle racism. But perhaps building on what Gloria Brown Marshall said when she argued that diversity is not the issue here, this is all about power, I would conclude this point by saying that it is about white supremacy, it is about power, and it is power that triggers the critique and the opposition to affirmative action. My third point is about memorialization and museums. The author of Between Memory and History, Pierre Nora, suggests that memory takes root in the concrete, in spaces, gestures, images, and objects. More so, memorials, museums, and other sites of what Professor Tillett called sites of memory, identity, and presence set in stone some level of permanence of what and how we remember. For instance, Barbara Lee gave an example yesterday of the Maya Angelou quarter, the first coin celebrating a Black woman, to argue that what matters is not just the symbolism, but also the stories of these Black women. Yet, as Eduardo Gonzalez argued today, memory markers have generally emerged through the hegemonic forces of white supremacy and power. We look around us, and most often the heroes we see are not those who felt victims of or resisted oppression, slavery, genocide, or settler colonialism. We look around us, and what we see, as Eduardo underlined, are men on horses, statues dedicated to men, rarely to women. We basically live in a world that still celebrates the histories of power and oppression. When I returned to Romania, sometimes I walked around my village where my Roma ancestors were enslaved, and there is no sign of slavery memory. So in such contexts, advocacy movements have long demanded sites of memory that mark their history and contributions. But at the same time, especially in the past few years, we've seen a push to unlearn the lies about the greatness of colonialism and the empire. All panelists talked about statues and statue removals, and we know that, for instance, many statues of King Leopold II in Belgium still glorify Leopold as a hero with ambitions, as a philanthropist who brought advancement to Congo. In Antwerp, for example, from 1873 to 2020, when it was taken down, his statue veiled a ruling based on exploitation and genocide. Thus, aside from whatever we may feel or think about statue removals, methods of unlearning and relearning are necessary. However, both Mary Tillett and Eduardo Gonzalez asked, what do we do with a monument that has been removed, or how do we replace them? The panelists used the examples of the statues of Christopher Columbus that were taken down in New Jersey and Mexico City. And in Mexico City, women, for instance, replaced it with the statue of the women who struggle. And in New Jersey, Professor Tillett and others worked on the Will You Be My Monument mural, as well as community activities, festivals, and the Tubman movement. So solutions are out there. And similarly, although not to replace statues, but talking about the work of the Smithsonian's Museum, Mary Elliott has worked with communities to identify artifacts, bring them into museums, and lift up the contributions of African Americans. In addition, initiatives such as those of Professor Catherine Hall, who cataloged enslavers, their compensations and assets, and is writing reparatory history, are possible paths in the process of reframing the empire, as she recently argued. Memorials and museums can have both reflective and educative functions, but I agree with Sabine Marshall and other authors who argue that memory sites are not enough to protect memory. They need, as our panelists also underlined today, to be backed up by active processes of remembrance. They can be kept alive, awakened, voiced, and strengthened by commemorations, arts, and history teaching, as well as community engagement and transformation and substantive dialogue, similar to Mary Elliott's preservation work. And finally, please allow me to add a few thoughts on reparations. In the past few decades, as Cornell Brooks noted today, we've seen people and movements demanding reparations in many, many corners of the world. Yet while conversations continue, actual reparations programs remain remarkably scarce, tokenistic, and even inexistent, as state institutions and other stakeholders have largely avoided to take responsibility and accountability. Nevertheless, we can think about reparations as the panacea, as the cure for racism and other oppressions. Reparations do not replace the imperative of power redistribution, representation in spaces of power, radical anti-racist reform, and the tearing down of white supremacy. Reparations are essential, however, not only as a way of making amends for and repairing historical injustices, but also to establish a moral break with a brutal past. In the processes of reparations, I would say that financial compensations are a must, and so are apologies, truth-telling methods, remembrance and memorialization, and most importantly, any other methods of reparations that the members of communities affected find compelling. However, monetary compensations, as Cornell Brooks suggested, reparatory compensations has always been a controversial topic, particularly in relation to historical racial injustices. However, as Professor Brooks showed, in the US, there is a norm to recognize people who have suffered the harm and a state effort to repair, but often is not about it's about a non-racial harm. And John Tateshi talked about the 1942 internment camps, sharing that sometimes members of communities themselves questioned money as a form of repair for their harm and pain. And indeed, the restorative process was so much more, as he explained. The aim was to help the country heal, redress the injustices, and prevent the country from doing that again. Nevertheless, compensations as one of the many tools of reparatory work are arguably a critical element. Cornell Brooks and others mentioned the work of Sandy Doherty, who calculated that today, for instance, the average net worth of wealth in Black families is about $800,000 less than in white families. And in this context, while state responses are missing, non-state responses come from work such as that of Yahya Al-Azraq and Resource Generations, which focus on redistributive and economic justice. And a different path has been taken in the UK. Esther Stanford Kosei talked about the movement of African reparations, a movement that goes back centuries ago, but it's both local and global in nature, not tied to enslavement, but linking itself to movements of environmental repair. And speaking of the global, one of the central elements of the IARA conference has been its focus on global work and exchange, and what Eduardo Gonzalez called diasporic knowledge. And indeed, the Truth Commission in South Africa was established based on the lessons of the Commission in Chile. And the Commission in South Africa inspired many initiatives across the world. Thus, and I will conclude here, as we reflect on this wealth of experience and global knowledge and learn one from another, and while recognizing our specificities, we could also rise in solidarity in demanding reparations and reparative justice. Thank you very much.
I want to thank you so very much to Dr. Matache for what I would say, and I hope all of you would agree, was a masterclass in closing remarks. I mean, if I didn't know her myself, and to know her as a wonderful human being and an amazing person and a brilliant scholar, I'd say that somehow she had like a Mad Lib version of this speech with sections already written and just drop in here when person speaks. Just truly magnificent. And I want to lift up the fact that it's not just that she's been listening very carefully to all of the knowledge that has been imparted today, but that she is actually a co-author of a work that I think all of you who are newish to this conversation can consider picking up. She is co-author of Time for Reparations, A Global Perspective, a book that only was published just a little while ago. A Time for Reparations, A Global Perspective, and you can buy it anywhere that you purchase a book. So I just want to say personally how grateful I am, Magda, for your remarks this afternoon. And I know that everyone listening to this conference today and even yesterday appreciate the way you so brilliantly tied so much together. I have one coda to what she said, and I think it's just a very simple way to send you home with a message about the importance of historical reckoning, a message about the commitment to discard doctrines of discovery, as we heard our keynote talk about today, and a reminder of the ways in which the national and international stories we tell about the world we live in are consequential for the future world we make. And so here is a kind of paraphrase from the great scholar Evelyn Nakano Glenn. And I'm both quoting and paraphrasing. She says, the colonial settler hides behind his labor and hardship, noting that the settler does not dispossess anyone. He wrestles with the land to sustain his family. The settler enters a, quote, new empty land to start a new life. And consequently, indigenous people naturally and inevitably vanish. It is not settlers that displace them. And to conclude, according to Glenn, whose wonderful work on settler colonialism helps to explain so much, it is settler colonialism that obscures the conditions of its own production. And so we have to be ever vigilant about guarding against the continuation of these forms of settler colonialism that insist constantly upon denial, and disavowal of the very processes that were built to exploit and to extract. So I leave you with that parting thought. And I also want to say thank you to the entire IARA team and the Ash Center team at the Harvard Kennedy School. I want to thank all of our student volunteers, to thank our speakers, our panelists, our keynote presenters, our workshop facilitators, and of course, unfortunately, for those of you who are virtual, did not enjoy the food that came along with the in-person forms of this conference, but as well our catering staff. And with that, the fourth conference of the Truth and Transformation Conference of the IARA Project concludes. I look forward to seeing you on some of our programs between now and next fall. Thank you very much for attending.